September 12th, 1940. Croydon, South London. The wail of air raid sirens had become a grim kind of music. Windows rattled, mothers hurried their children into shelters, and somewhere above the blacked-out streets, the steady hum of Luftwaffe bombers crept closer. But this night, something was different. On a quiet suburban street, a 43-year-old schoolteacher named Charles Logue stood by his window, not hiding, not praying, but watching. His curtains were drawn tight, but a small slit let in just enough light from the moon to reflect off a small square mirror clutched in his hand. On the table beside him, a battered map of Greater London was marked with small pencil lines and pins. He adjusted the angle of the mirror slightly, just enough to catch the faint glow of the night sky. Across the street, another mirror flashed back, a signal from his neighbor, a railway clerk named Ellis. Then another from a rooftop 2 blocks away. To any passerby, it would look like nothing. But to Logue, this was the start of an experiment. For weeks, he'd been noticing something strange. The bombers always came in patterns, long, droning waves that seemed to shift depending on moonlight, wind, and the river's reflection. London wasn't just being bombed randomly. It was being studied. And so, like any school teacher faced with a puzzle, Charles Logue decided to study back. He began charting the sound of engines, timing the moments between sirens. He scribbled frantic notes in the margins of his students' arithmetic papers. Engines, northwest to southeast, 2317. Wind, east by northeast. Bombs near Woolwich. And now, with the help of a few household mirrors placed at precise angles across rooftops, he believed he could see the bombers before radar could. Outside, the rumble grew louder. Shadows passed over the rooftops. A formation of Heinkel Hay 111s, the Luftwaffe's workhorses, glided through the thin mist, their navigation lights flickering faintly under blackout regulations. Logue watched his mirror. A thin silver reflection appeared, there, just above the tree line, matching his predictions on the map. He noted the angle, adjusted a pin, and drew a new line connecting Croydon to Deptford. He leaned over the map, his pulse racing. If his calculations were right, the next wave wouldn't hit central London. It would veer south, straight toward the docks. And if he was right again, someone could warn them. But who would believe a school teacher with a handful of mirrors and a map? He didn't know it yet, but within hours, his discovery would make its way into the corridors of Britain's early warning network and pit one civilian's intuition against the precision machinery of the Luftwaffe. And tonight, the test would come. The first bombs fell miles away, exactly where he'd predicted. Charles Logue exhaled. His hands trembled. It wasn't luck, it was geometry. And somewhere in that flicker of realization, a quiet war had begun. One man, a city under siege, and a race against the machines of the sky.
For most people, the Blitz was a nightmare of noise and fire, a nightly lottery of survival. For Charles Logue, it was a pattern waiting to be solved. By day, he taught arithmetic to 10-year-olds in a cramped South London classroom, chalk dust clinging to his sleeves. By night, he transformed his small sitting room into a war room. Every evening, he drew thick curtains, lit a single candle, and spread maps across the floor. The city became his equation. Pins marked previous bomb strikes, red for confirmed hits, blue for near misses. He plotted them night after night, tracing arcs that curved across London like constellations. The more he plotted, the more he saw it. The Luftwaffe's bombing routes followed invisible corridors in the sky. Corridors defined by moonlight, wind direction, and the faint reflection of the River Thames. And then came his idea: the mirrors. At first, it sounded absurd, even to him. But Logue had noticed that from certain points in Croydon, the gleam of approaching aircraft could be caught minutes before the human ear could detect the sound. The bombers' silver bellies reflected the faintest glint of moonlight long before they were overhead. If he could position mirrors to catch those reflections just right, he could see them coming. He started small. A shaving mirror propped on a windowsill, a hand mirror borrowed from a neighbor. Within days, half a dozen residents had joined his experiment, each with a mirror tilted at an angle calculated by Logue's hand-drawn trigonometric tables. He sent notes through back doors and in grocery lines. Angle your mirror 14 degrees north-northeast. Report any light between 22:30 and 23:10. It was part science, part madness, but it worked. Within a week, his crude mirror network could predict the approach of a bomber wave 5 to 6 minutes before sirens sounded. By the second week, it was nearly 8 minutes. 8 minutes. That was an eternity in a bombing raid. He took his notes to the local air raid precautions post, explaining how his readings matched incoming raids. The officer on duty, a young man in uniform no older than Logue's students, squinted at the scribbled maps. Mirrors and moonlight. You're saying you can see them before radar? Logue nodded. The officer shook his head, muttering something about amateurs and luck. But when another bombing pattern matched Logue's warnings, precisely, word began to spread. Soon, he was quietly summoned to a small RAF outpost on the edge of Surrey, where his findings caught the attention of Flight Lieutenant Gerald Nichols, part of the Early Warning Coordination Team. Nichols didn't laugh. He listened. And then he did something no one else had done. He asked him to prove it. That night, Nichols stood beside him in the dark, both men staring into the faint gleam of a mirror on the windowsill. The air was thick, the silence tense. Then a flash, barely perceptible. Nichols leaned closer. Was that? Wait for it, Logue whispered. Moments later, the low, distant hum of bombers filled the sky. Nichols checked his watch. 7 minutes early. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The next morning, a call came from RAF Bentley Priory, home of Fighter Command. They wanted to hear from the civilian who was seeing bombers before their radar screens could. Logue didn't know it yet, but he was about to walk into a world of military secrecy, skepticism, and quiet admiration, a world where math met war, and mirrors might just change the course of a city's survival. And somewhere over the channel, the Luftwaffe had already changed their tactics. The morning fog clung low over the fields as Charles Logue's bus rattled toward Bentley Priory, the nerve center of Fighter Command. Inside those walls, radar plots, telephone calls, and chalkboards directed every interception of the Battle of Britain. To Logue, it felt like stepping into the brain of the war. Men and women in uniform rushed between map tables, pushing colored markers with long sticks. Telephones rang without pause. Every few seconds, someone shouted coordinates, a grid reference, a heading, a time. It was organized chaos. And in the middle of it all, watching quietly from the shadows, stood Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the stoic architect of Britain's air defense system. He was a man who had placed his faith in a new technology, radar, to keep Britain alive. So, when a civilian schoolteacher was ushered into his war room, holding a rolled-up street map and a shaving mirror, the scene felt absurd. Dowding studied Logue in silence for a moment. "You're the gentleman from Croydon, are you? The one predicting raids with mirrors?" "Yes, sir. I've been charting reflections and moonlight vectors. They align with flight paths, almost perfectly." Dowding arched a brow. Vectors and moonlight. The room stifled a chuckle. But Logue unrolled his map and began to speak with the urgency of a man who didn't care about ridicule. He showed pinpoints where his mirror network had detected incoming formations before radar had. He described how the Thames acted as a natural guide for Luftwaffe navigators, and how the shifting moon phases dictated which sectors of London glowed faintly enough for bombing runs. "Your radar can't see through cloud cover," Logue said, "but the moonlight does. And so can I." Dowding frowned, but not in disbelief, in thought. He leaned over the table. "You're saying you can predict not only when they'll come, but where they'll drop their bombs?" "Yes, sir, with practice and enough mirrors." Silence. The kind that weighs heavy in rooms where decisions change lives. Finally, Dowding spoke. "Very well, Mr. Logue. We'll test your theory." And so began one of the most curious collaborations of the war. Fighter Command discreetly provided Logue with coordinates from the Royal Observer Corps, and in return, Logue fed them projected approach paths based on his nightly observations. His data was entered into early warning reports under the code name Operation Looking Glass. At first, many in the RAF treated it as a novelty, an eccentric hobby from a clever man with too much time. But the results were undeniable. On September 18th, Logue's predicted vector for a bombing run over the docks was confirmed to the minute. On September 21st, he correctly identified a diversionary formation heading north to confuse radar, something the radar stations themselves had misinterpreted. By the end of the month, his mirror sightings had given early warning posts up to 12 minutes of advanced notice. It wasn't magic, it was observation, human intuition turned into a weapon. But success drew attention, and attention drew danger. One evening, while returning home from the air raid post, Logue found his front door ajar. His notes, the ones filled with mirror positions and angles, were missing. A single page was left behind, pinned to his map with a knife. On it, a message scrawled in shaky German handwriting. "The sky is ours, teacher. Stay out of it." The Luftwaffe had noticed him. And somewhere, perhaps from across the channel, someone in a cockpit now knew the name Charles Logue.
October 3rd, 1940, 22:47 hours. The wind had changed over the channel. The air was still, heavy, the kind of night where sound carried far and moonlight cut sharp through the haze. Charles Logue stood again at his window, staring at the gleam of his mirrors. But something felt wrong.
For days his calculations hadn't aligned. Reflections appeared where none should, lights flashed where no aircraft were expected. It was as if the Luftwaffe were playing with his method, feeding him false signals. And then he realized they were. Word had spread among intelligence officers. The Germans had begun experimenting with countermeasures, releasing flares and decoy beams to throw off both radar and visual spotters. Someone, somewhere, had learned about the Mirror Man in Croydon. But Logue refused to give up. He spent the next 48 hours recalculating from scratch, adjusting for light distortion, humidity, even the faint sheen of London's rooftops under blackout. He realized the Luftwaffe wasn't just using decoy lights, they were using the Thames itself as a natural reflector. If they could use light against him, he could use geometry against them. That night, he changed his approach. He positioned mirrors facing away from the expected direction, catching only the faintest backscatter of light. It was like looking at shadows of shadows. But it worked. At 22:51, a flash. Subtle, brief, but out of place. He triangulated the angle, his pencil racing across the map. The result stopped his breath. A new approach corridor, one that would bypass the usual routes entirely. Not over Croydon, not over the docks, but toward Paddington, a densely populated area that had rarely been hit before. He picked up the telephone, calling his RAF liaison line. The operator hesitated. "Sir, there's no radar confirmation of any incoming formation. Are you sure?" Logue's voice was sharp. "I'm not sure. But if I'm right, they'll be over Paddington in 7 minutes." There was silence. Then the operator replied, "Understood. I'll pass it up the line." 7 minutes later, the first bombs fell, precisely over Paddington Station. The station's night crew had already evacuated, and the trains had been halted. The loss of life, though tragic, was a fraction of what it could have been. When word reached Fighter Command that Logue's unverified warning had saved hundreds, the tone changed. Operation Looking Glass was no longer a curiosity. It was quietly integrated into the air defense system as a supplemental method for visual forecasting. From that night on, Logue wasn't just a schoolteacher with mirrors. He was a civilian analyst, an unsung link in Britain's invisible shield. But the war in the air was evolving faster than any of them could predict. The Luftwaffe began switching to high-altitude raids, exploiting cloud cover that even moonlight couldn't pierce. And Britain's radar technology, once behind, was now improving rapidly. Logue knew his mirror's days were numbered. His crude optical network was giving way to cathodes greens and radio pulses. Still, he kept at it. Every night he polished the glass, checked his bearings, and took his readings, because as long as London burned, he couldn't stop watching. And then one night in November, something extraordinary happened. At exactly 23:09, Logue caught a reflection unlike any he'd seen before. Bright, steady, unwavering. He measured the angle twice, then 3 times. It wasn't an aircraft, it wasn't a flare. It was coming from the sky above Kent, pulsing in rhythm. He called it in. The message was relayed to Fighter Command, and within half an hour, an RAF patrol intercepted a Heinkel Pathfinder aircraft, broadcasting a coded navigation beam. The Germans had been guiding bombers with radio signals, disguised as light pulses, a secret tactic known only to a handful of Allied scientists. Logue had discovered it by accident, with a mirror. That night, the RAF recorded one of their first confirmed interceptions of a Knickbane beam transmitter, a turning point in Britain's understanding of German electronic warfare. But Charles Logue wouldn't know that until much later. He was still standing by his window, pencil in hand, when the sirens finally went silent. For the first time in months, the sky over London was dark, and stayed dark. He looked down at his mirrors, their surfaces speckled with ash and dust, and smiled faintly. "Seems the sky's finally learning," he murmured. He had done his part. And though radar would take the glory, somewhere deep in the archives of Fighter Command, a small folder labeled Operation Looking Glass recorded the improbable truth that for a few desperate weeks in 1940, a British schoolteacher with a map and a mirror had outwitted the Luftwaffe.